Cold Chain Connect webinar brought to you by the Cold Chain Federation. I'm Tom Southall, Deputy Chief Exec at CCF, on hosting duty today. I'm delighted to be joined by Dan and Claire from npower Business Solutions for today's webinar. We'll introduce Dan and Claire in a moment, but if you're new to Cold Chain Connects, this is our regular webinar series that we hold most Tuesdays to talk about a emerging or important issue facing the cold chain industry. CCF is the voice of the UK's cold chain, and we've got about 350 members across the temperature controlled logistics industry, and we campaign and advise and network on a whole range of issues, but one of our most prominent is energy, with cold store operators using a significant amount of energy in their operations, and the energy landscape in the UK changing significantly, both in pricing but also in the very fabric of the energy grid that the cold chain sector relies on. So as well as services like the climate change agreement, we're also very keen to talk about the future of the energy network and how that relates to cold chain businesses. And an area that we've talked about quite frequently in recent years has been the ability of cold storage infrastructure to play a role in the balancing of the grid, in turn up and turn down demand management, and that's really developing as the government invests in wind and solar, and then there's a greater need to engage with major industry users to play a part in the UK grid, and that's really coming to a head as we're going to hear today. And we're delighted to have npower Business Solutions as platinum partners of the CCF, and this being a really major issue for the team at npower to support members with. So this is a really important time to host this webinar, and it's one of two webinars we're hosting on a similar topic over the next few weeks, and I'll touch on the second webinar towards the end. But we're going to talk about all of that today, the current landscape for demand management, and go into some of that detail about how cold chain businesses can take part in some of the services that are available. If you'd like to ask your questions, please type those into the question box. So you'll find that in the top right corner of the panel, that speech bubble with a question mark in. Please type in your questions whenever, and I'll be back at the end to put those questions to our guests. But I'm delighted to introduce Claire Caple and Dan Owen from npower Business Solutions, who are going to be going through the energy market and specifically focusing on the opportunities from flexibility. So thanks for joining us both. I think I'm handing over to you first, Claire, to go through today's presentation, then handing over to Dan about midway through. But thanks for joining us, and over to you for today's presentation.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so we'll be talking about myself. I'll be covering the non-commodity costs. That's sort of where I work in npower Business Solutions, and then I'll be passing over to Dan, who's going to talk about a bit about some flexibility services. So let's make a start. If you could go to the next slide for me then. Yeah, so there are quite a lot of non-commodity costs that show up in consumer bills. There's a list of pretty much all of them there that we deal with in our team. You'll see a lot of them are on electricity bills, just from the lightning bolt symbol, and gas bills from the flame symbol. We'll be covering just a few of them today, the ones that are most relevant to the topics at hand. So we do have an energy cost calculator that our team supports providing data for, where you can forecast your non-commodity costs in less than 60 seconds, which is sort of a projection of a typical expected change in expenditure over the next few years up to 2030. Now, you can see just from the screenshot there that there is a fair amount of rises expected. That's not atypical, that 70% increase. Now, there is some government support on the way to help with non-commodity costs for some users, but unfortunately that doesn't generally cover anything in the cold chain. It's mostly sort of manufacturing focused. If we can go on to the next one. So I expect if anyone's sort of joined any of our previous discussions or saw us at a previous stand that we had, they'd have heard about Clean Power 2030, which is the government's commitment to generate 95% of electricity from clean sources by 2030. There are a lot of steps involved in that. There's kind of a list of the main focuses on the left-hand side, but we still need to gain by that time another contracted quantity of clean sources to actually meet that target. It's going to be quite difficult to meet the target. That's quite a few gigawatts of energy we need there. So on the right hand side, sort of our view of the additional renewable generation that we would need to meet that goal. So if we could move on. So as part of that Clean Power 2030, we have an impact on several of our non-commodity costs. CFD, or contract for difference, that's to do with paying generators a fixed price unit price for their energy that they generate over their contracted period. And there's a Dutch auction held for that pretty much every year in order to encourage renewables. The government sets a budget, and once enough people have dropped out of the auction through the prices decreasing to meet that whole spend pretty much, then that is where the prices will then be set at that level for everyone in a given category. Now, the rate for that is going up because with the most recent auction that happened in January, that was the biggest auction that's been held so far, and the one this summer, which has actually been moved forward, it should have been next year, AR8, they're going to really try and push to meet that 2030 capacity target that we mentioned on the previous table. But yeah, there'll be large volumes of generation, and the costs will increase because this cost, though the government set the budget, the cost is borne by the consumer to top up from the wholesale price to those set rates for those generators. Next slide. So TNUoS. So this is the cost that is required to build and maintain the transmission network long distance across the electricity system. Now, the issue with all this new generation being built is that it's not necessarily placed where the demand is. There's a lot of new generation, particularly wind farms up towards Scotland, and we already have a problem quite frequently on very windy days that there's more generation that is needed up north, but you can't actually get it to south where the demand is because the transmission system does not have enough capacity. So in order to deliver these ambitious targets, there needs to be a big build out of the transmission system. So there's a 5-year period called a RIIO period for which Ofgem decide what can be claimed for cost-wise, and we now have the first year set that started this month, and was quite a significant increase in cost for consumers of around 63%, and we can expect a lot more to continue over the next several years. I think it's another 50% increase on the current year's prices by 2031. So it's quite an increase to worry about over time for everybody. Next slide. So this is the balancing cost. This is quite difficult to predict because the point of this cost is to make sure that every area of the grid is balanced with what's coming in and what's going out at every minute of the day. Now, obviously, with that extra generation up north, you have to pay that generation to switch off. And then if you don't have enough generation down south, even at the same time, you have to pay more generation to switch on. So if the network build out keeps up with the requirements, then those costs could stay fairly stable over the next few years. But if they continue to rise because more generation is coming online and more generation needs to be paid elsewhere, then it's a problem. So we're going to have to be keeping an eye on how that network build out comes in to play. But just as a separate point, it is affected by wholesale prices. So the current situation with the wholesale prices rising does actually make this cost higher. So that's just an extra thing to be aware of. Next one. So just moving on to a few points that are affected by flexibility. So there are a couple of non-commodity costs you can actually have an impact on by being flexible in your consumption. So capacity market is really the biggest one. It applies during winter peak hours from November to February between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. The cost for the capacity market charge is in the region of £300 plus per megawatt hour during these half hours. So reducing your consumption during these peak periods, even just by shifting it to somewhere else in the day, can actually make a big difference to your energy costs. Next one. It's a smaller element for distribution use of system or DUOS charges, because there's a lot of fixed charges on DUOS, but there are still some unit rates there. And you get charged different rates based on where in the day you're consuming. So you have time bands for low voltage and high voltage, 3 different ones, with the red being most expensive and amber next in price. So if you can shift some out of red to amber, then you can reduce. And also for the extra high voltage properties, there's just a super red time band, which applies during those peak periods. So again, those are the high rates that you want to try to avoid if you can. Next one. So capacity banding. Now this is quite a involved topic for sites, but generally a large proportion of network charges, TNUoS and DUOS, are based upon the observed capacity of each site, which is the maximum amount of energy you can draw from the grid at any one time. Now, bandings for these sites affect how much you pay, and moving up from one band to the next can cost you quite a lot of money over time. Now, they're set for a 5-year period to align to the transmission or TNUoS RIO period. They apply for the same time frame for DUOS, even though that has a different RIO period. So it's the same 5 years that began this month. You will be paying according to your banding for this period. Now, you cannot change your banding within a 5-year period unless your consumption changes by over 50%. Though there has been a change proposed that's in very early stages to allow more frequent changes for less movement, but that's really uncertain at the moment whether that would get approved. We'd have to keep an eye on that one. But the observation window where they set your band occurs during the 5-year period. So if you reduce your capacity over the next couple of years, the next 5-year period could see your band being lowered. So it's just sort of planning for the future in this case. But we will be following up in May with a discussion of the pros and cons of changing your banding. So do keep an eye out on the npower Business Solution LinkedIn, discussing sort of those points. And just a slight sidestep into wholesale pricing, which is not my usual area, but some energy customers do choose to buy part of their electricity from the wholesale market using the N2EX day ahead price. This is a price index that varies, excuse me, that varies hourly and is typically higher at peak times. So by shifting your energy out of those peak hours, you could reduce your cost overall. If you'd like to understand this pricing more, then please speak to the Cold Chain Federation, who can put you in contact with the right representative from NBS, but we don't have time for detail today. And that, in summary, non-commodity costs expected to rise significantly over the next few years. Reducing your consumption at certain times of day can lower your overall energy costs. And you may want to adjust your capacity over time, but consider future-proofing your business, which again will go into more detail in the pros and cons in May. And thank you. That's all from me, and I'll be handing over to Dan now to talk to you more about flexibility.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. And yeah, welcome to everyone. So Dan Owen, I'm the lead flexibility manager. Now I've worked for the business for 29 years, and I have never seen the rate of change that's happening right now and what's coming as well. So the reason we're here, the reason we're partnering with the Cold Chain Federation is to make sure that the messages are clear, that we're here from an education point of view. So what you're not going to see over the next 15 minutes is me trying to do a sales pitch. It's got nothing to do with that. This is about bringing that education. So please, if you've got any questions, whether we've got enough time to answer them all at the end of this or not, please do reach out. This is about making sure you understand what's coming and what's happening. And flexibility is something which is very close to my heart, but 15 minutes isn't very long. So this is just start one, and there'll be a range of people's experience with flexibility on this webinar right now. So I'm having to keep it relatively generic as a starting point, but straight after this, we'll have a flex guide that's going to come out straight afterwards. And this is just stage one. Over the days, weeks, and months, we will continue this message, and we will continue to help with that education piece. We are partners with the Federation, and we just love to keep this conversation going. So we've just heard from Claire. You know, these costs are coming. You know, your consumption largely, in some cases, it doesn't matter how much you reduce your consumption, some of these third-party costs are going to hit you no matter what. So what can you do about it? And flexibility is the way that you bridge that gap. But before you approach that, you need to know what you can flex. So before you start thinking about avoidance savings or which of those services you want to access, actually, you need to understand what assets you have got on site and what you can do right now. And I really want to make the point, this isn't about having to invest, having to spend money to access flexibility. It's about saying, what can we do with what we've existingly got? We have looked at many different industries with flexibility, and none are as well placed to take advantage of flexibility as the cold chain are. And one of the main reasons for that is that refrigeration plant. So that refrigeration compressor and condensers, that typically represents around 60 to 80% of the total electricity consumed throughout your industry. And ultimately, that cold storage is a thermal battery, and that can be used to great effect. Now, if you think about how expensive traditional batteries are, which are largely seen as the gold standard for how we can help grid constraints, certainly the government would look at them favorably. Well, actually, the cold store can replicate that. It is a fantastic thermal battery, but it does require a change of thought in terms of how you look at those cold stores. And I'm fairly sure some of you will already be on this journey. You'll be thinking about it, but there'll be others who'll be thinking, well, actually, no, I've been very protective over my temperature. I've been very obsessed about my temperature, and that largely comes from a sustainability agenda. But that green at all costs, which I'm not saying is a wrong thing, but that has a focus on just constantly reducing consumption. And whereas the commercial advantages and the way that we can offset some of these third-party costs is by looking about when you use, not just about how much you reduce. So that refrigeration plant makes the cold chain an incredible poster child for flexibility. But beyond that, there are the other things as well, other heating and ventilation and air conditioning and lighting. And we see that we have some cold stores now which have these blackout times where you've got automatic lighting, but there's loads more that can be done. And increasingly what we're seeing is machinery and assets where actually they've just been installed and they're at manufacturers' thresholds. Actually, they can be tweaked and to be looked at to make better advantage from. So HVACs, conditioning, lighting should all be within the scope of what you look at. But also we know that the cold chain has heavily invested in sustainability. In fact, very advanced compared to most industries. So there's a lot of on-site generation. EV has been adopted. And what you need to do really is how can you make advantage of that? So rather than just those things that have been invested in to hit that sustainability box, actually, how do you now commercialize that? How can you use that to access flexibility? And the overall message for this slide, I'm going to leave it on, is you need to audit your site's flex potential. And if you haven't, that is your first step to take. And it goes beyond the obvious stuff. It's not just that cold store. It's everything on site. So auditing that and understanding what can you do today should be step one, way before you think about investing any of the money. Next slide, please. So you cannot manage what you can't see. So the challenge we've got is that for a lot of people, half-hourly consumption is what they're managing. So you've got your meter level consumption, and actually we've heard through the cold chain live and summits previously from last year that actually sub-metering is at a relatively low level. And if you just look at that half-hourly, that aggregated half-hourly consumption data, it doesn't tell you where and why you've got spikes or even why you've got drop-offs. You need to understand that with asset level granularity. And if you don't, you cannot target, really, not particularly. You can't just use half-hourly data and be super specific. And those manual meter readings, and if you collect stuff on spreadsheets, which is how things are typically being done, you're going to have blind spots. And quite frankly, every flex window opportunity that comes up should be seen as a missed opportunity for revenue, to make revenue and savings, but you're never going to be able to capitalize on that until you can really see what's being used on site. So I think there's another box now, Tom, if you could tap along for me. So what does great look like? So asset level monitoring. I use the word sub-metering fairly generally here. Okay, so it doesn't need to be a traditional sub-metering. It could be smart sensor data, but it's something which is coming back to you to tell you exactly what is being used on site, when, how, that allows insight to be used to make tailored strategic plans. Because flexibility, it shouldn't just be seen as a revenue add-on. It's a strategic enablement. It's a strategic capability. It goes way beyond just revenue. It's ultimately how you plan for the world that we're moving into. And once you've got that visualization, now you can start to manage it. But what you do need is, if you don't have the in-house expertise, if you haven't got the energy data scientists whose job it is to look at this, you need to find a partner who can. And I want to remain agnostic. I want to remain agnostic entirely. Just ask yourself, does the partner you work with, do they have the capability to do this? So what they'll look for is they'll look for windows which are specific to your operations. They'll understand what's being used and where. There might be some blind spots, like I say, some bits of equipment that you don't even think about, which you're able to flex at times when other bits of machinery can't. But having those data scientists to make tailored responses to you and your site is really quite vital. And as is, coming off of that spreadsheet, manual reading, that is very much old world. You need to make sure that you've got access to platforms which give you real-time alerts that are constantly keeping you informed, constantly giving you insight, that keep you in control 24/7. So this is absolutely one of the starting points, really. You can't manage what you can't see. Get visualization of what's being used on your site. Thanks. Next slide, please. Oh, and yeah, just to making the point there, find the right partner to do that. I do apologize. Next slide. So does your contract unlock flexibility? If I'm being honest, I think sustainability agenda has been decoupled from energy strategy. So that at times what happens is you've really achieved within the cold chain industry, you've really achieved sustainability at a remarkable pace, and it should be admired. Other people should look at your industry and say, wow, that is gold standard. But it hasn't always been done with energy in mind as well. And then that means you can block yourself, you can lock yourself out of flexibility because of what you've done through sustainability, and you've just put a fairly generic contract in place for your energy. Now they come in various different formats, but three very obvious ones. So you've got time of use pass through. So time of use is just multiple rates throughout the day, which incentivize you to use your consumption outside of those peak hours. But when you look at those peak hours, which is 4 till 7, their prices are higher. So a traditional 2-rate comparison. So the world got squeezed down to 2 rates, and now it's no longer fit for purpose. And now we have multiple rates, but you do need to bear some things in mind. So this makes it gives you exposure to be able to directly shift loads into lower price periods. But there is an absolute risk here that if you've got some unplanned usage during those peak times, then actually you end up introducing commercial risk. So you really need to have a good grip on what you're consuming and when you're consuming it, and everything you want to do. This really supports, these time of use tariffs really support the ability to do inch by inch movements. So I'm going to drag as much as possible as I can out of those peak times. I'm going to do it. I can do it over a longer period of time if I will. So I like to think of the time of use tariff as like a a playing field to play a sport on, and then you create the rules of the sport you want to play on, but it gives you the freedom to be able to do that. But please bear in mind, if you use unplanned consumption during those peak times, that is a cost risk. Next box, please. So flexible products. So this is perfect for flexibility. Now we will share these slides afterwards. So if some of the terms that we're using here don't mean anything to you, we'll make sure this is all jargon checked for you. But once you're on a flexible contract, that exposes your ability to take to be able to go after all of that price arbitrage. So how do I chase market signals? But it also means that you're fit for things like firm frequency response, balancing mechanism, demand side response. It's an ideal product for that. You can easily link your hedging and flexibility strategy together and sustainability when you're on a flexible product. It gives you the most freedom. But the watch out here is there are so many different types of flexible products, and every supplier is going to have a different nuance. So it really requires you to fully understand what are you signing up to, and do you fully understand it? Next box, please. And fully fixed contracts. So this is where we have typically seen people get locked out of flexibility because they look good for budget, right? And I would never argue against that. If budget certainty is your absolute red line, I must have it. I understand why people have taken fully priced contracts. The trouble is the best price on day one may not actually be the best price by day 365, because these fixed products don't allow you to maximize the amount of value you could through the previous two types of contracts. So it limits your ability to get into that flexibility space. Not that many suppliers have flexibility products that work with a fixed contract. So you'd need to reach out to them to say, look, what can we do here? Am I locked out or not? But certainly one of the conversations that I had at the summit a couple of weeks back, a lot of people saying we did go with a fixed product and now we feel like we've locked ourselves out. So that's where conversations have continued between myself and them, say, look, what can we do to help with that? Okay, next. Oh, actually, so what I would like you to do actually is a final thought on that. Please, when you come to your next renewal, ask yourself the question, does this agreement allow me to get to that flexibility, to commercialize my consumption? Next slide, please. So a follow-on. So good hedging ultimately allows opportunity and chaos. So we're in a world at the moment where geopolitical issues are causing prices to go up again, quite volatile. That could be a reason to panic, but actually if you've had a really good hedging strategy, so if you've brought together your flexibility, your sustainability and your commodity to have a really good strategy, this isn't a problem, this is an opportunity. Basically you get to, when the prices are rising, and so the day ahead, the market is a continually moving thing. And it's not just a whole day's price. Each hour within our days, they've all got different prices. And that opens up an opportunity. So you have an ability to say, okay, let me make up some numbers here to make this simple, make my point simple. I've hedged at 5, and now the day ahead price is at 10. Flexibility allows you to access that on a wholesale market. So how do I now manage to interrupt my supply? Because I can see there's an advantage in a couple of hours on the following day, and I'm prepared to shift my volume out of there to a different time of the day or interrupt it entirely. But I get to sell back my volume at that particular point in time. And that gives you a commercial advantage. But beyond that, there's an ability to chase market signals. So increasingly what we're seeing and we're working with is customers who use our forecast of what's going on in this constantly moving world that's got more volatile than ever. And they're using that insight to actually set their productivity. So they're chasing. So when prices are particularly high, they're turning volume down as much as possible. But there's the reverse true as well. We're seeing negative prices coming through. And actually that's an opportunity to use price signals to turn volume up. But my overall message is stack these things. So when we're talking about all these flexibility services, there are more than I'm going to be able to talk about in these 15 minutes. There are multiple. I'd probably run out of fingers if I'm being honest with you. So the whole idea is to stack them. Some of these services are compatible and stackable. You can bring them together, and that's where these numbers make massive sense. This is where we can see at the extreme end 6-figure annual returns. Next box, please. And I'm just going to go over this very quickly. asset steering. So we know there are still plenty of people that if we were to send a signal to them, they are literally running around. There's a facilities manager saying we're going to switch that off, switch this on, and that becomes laborious. So what we're increasingly seeing is a move to automation, and at the advanced optimized end, that's being done through artificial intelligence, and that steering uses real-time grid to control assets on site. And as I said at the beginning of this, it's multiple assets, not just that cold store, and it's working within thresholds. And sometimes accessing flexibility doesn't require you to interrupt any productivity at all. So this is something that we're going to tell you a lot more over coming weeks, but something to definitely have on your radar. So if you are still reliant on that facilities walk around, now is that time to start looking at the alternatives. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to leave you with a checklist ultimately. So I've very much done this down, and I know this looks very simplified, but remember, this is day one of a journey we want to keep going on and keep finessing. But this is the 5 points, 5 stages, if you will, of how do I start my flexibility and where should it get to? It's audit your flexible assets. What can we do right now? Not spending a penny. What can we do right now? And finding the right partner to do that with. Get asset level visibility. That means, how do I understand what all of these different things, what are they consuming and how do they contribute to my overall half-hourly consumption? But then also, what am I using to make sense of that, and who are the partners that can help me make sense of it? Review your contract. Do not hamstring yourself to not being able to release all this great flexible value by having an energy contract that doesn't allow you to. Make sure that's part of your tender consideration. Optimize your hedging. Ensure there's a great strategy which builds flexibility in mind. And then that nice eye on the future, and I say it's on the future, it's in the here and now, really. It's that automate asset steering. How do I stop myself having to run around and to do all of this? How can that be controlled remotely? And I just want to make the point that I know the cold chain has been completely essential to food security and stability, but the electricity system and the resilience and all these prices and everything coming down are now becoming critical to you. We genuinely understand how much this impacts your operations. And any insight we can give you, we're here as a partner, and that flexibility, as far as I'm concerned, I think it helps bridge the gap to how you carry on doing what you need to do, but do it in a way which becomes cost effective and makes you more resilient for the world which we're stepping into. So thanks very much. And Tom, I think it's over to yourself now to see if we've got any questions that have come through.
Thanks, Dan. That was fascinating and clear as well. I certainly learned a lot there. About some of those, I guess, the decisions and how businesses can take advantage of some of those opportunities you mentioned. What really strikes me, I guess, is we know prices are going up, as Claire explained, but obviously things going on in the Middle East as well, that everything's driving costs upwards, and we know that cold stores in particular are that golden opportunity for flexible demand. So it kind of comes down to those mechanisms that are available, and then the appetite or the ability of businesses to kind of take advantage of them or to participate in them. Yeah. So I think you gave some really good advice there about how they can do that. But one thing that really resonated was where you talked about fixed contracts can lock people out of some of these opportunities, and it's a bit of that balance of risk that in a volatile market you can see the sense in businesses fixing a tariff, but actually that means that some of these opportunities are kind of lost. Is that the sort of correct interpretation, that some of these mechanisms, it does come down to that appetite for risk and whether people can move away from a fixed contract to enable the opportunities of some of these mechanisms?
And it is a fine balance. And what I don't want to do is simplify and say today, oh, everyone should just give up budget certainty and just get used to being agile and facing into this. I understand it's not as simple as that, because actually there are end users on behalf of the businesses who are listening today who are actually demanding some costs up front as well. What I would say, my advice is, where you cannot come off of that fixed price, you need to speak to who your supplier is, who your routes to be able to bring flexibility to you as a business. Speak to them, say, what can you do if I'm on a fixed contract? Because some suppliers are able to access flexibility and have come up with products that can do it where others haven't. And again, I want to stay really agnostic here in terms of suppliers. but then that might then influence who you sign a fixed contract with. So you may still stay on a fixed contract, but you might choose a supplier that allows you to still access flexibility even though you stay on it. But I would urge those who are cost sensitive to challenge their thinking that says the world is changing at such a rapid pace, and the energy world is it's such a volatile place to be. Could I actually give up that budget certainty because I am commercially sensitive more than I am needing budget certainty? That is the time to ask the question right now, because the trouble is when you fix everything out, you're ultimately paying the highest price, because everyone has then got to take a view of the world over 1, 2, 3 year contracts and says, where do we think those third party costs are going to be? And suppliers are never going to make themselves worse off. You know, that's not commercially sensible. So just really challenge your thinking. Could you do something different? But then if you can't, ask your supplier, how do I still do flexibility on your fixed product?
And then in terms of the kind of, I guess, the mechanisms themselves. So you talked about certain times of the day when the energy is cheap or more expensive, that kind of thing. And then there are specific mechanisms that, or things that NESO have that people can sign up to. Claire outlined how that clean energy by 2030, that's really driving the kind of need for more businesses to take part in that system. Yeah. Do we expect some of these mechanisms to develop? So are there likely to be more opportunities? And therefore, I guess, a greater incentive for businesses to take part? Or is kind of is the system we have at the moment, is that already matured and this is kind of it and people need to get used to that? Or is it constantly evolving as well in terms of the level of incentives and flexibility on offer?
So I'm prepared to put my own opinion on the line here, okay, because this does require some crystal ball mentality. Yeah. Here's the fact. The fact is that what they're currently putting on offer, so if you look at those government incentives at the moment, is it having the desired effect? No. That's the fact, right? So where the crystal ball comes in is, where do we then see that going? What's going to happen? Well, I personally see incentives increasing. We're starting to hear language already coming through NESO, DESNES, Ofgem, which is indicating that, to say, you know, being honest, do I think there's a layer of not desperation, but maybe concern that this isn't working coming into play? Yes, I do. So what I see in the short term, I see incentives increasing, because the problem is the copper hasn't gone into the ground and we've gone past the point of no return, right? So there isn't enough copper in the ground to be able to solve these grid constraint issues. So they're going to have to happen one way or another. We're seeing a lot of data centers being greenlit. That's just going to make the capacity concerns even worse. So we're going to see localized areas which have real serious issues. And I think short term, what will happen is, yeah, incentives will increase. And those businesses which have at the very least understood what they can do are the ones that are going to capitalize, because there'll become a saturation point. There'll become a point where the incentives look so good that everyone's going to go, right, I'm going to jump on that. That's my bite point. That's my snap point. But if at that point you've now got to figure out, well, what's all my machinery doing? What's my equipment doing? How much could I pledge? Can I pledge 0.5 meg, 1 meg, 10 meg? I've got no idea. That might be a 3 to 6 month journey just to get a grip on it, by which time your competition, who had already learned, had already got themselves into a position knowing what they can do, they've already snapped up these opportunities. Yeah. I can also see a world where carrot turns to stick. So I was in Essen just a few weeks back, listening to what's happening in the Netherlands and Germany, and their incentives haven't been working. And the language was very much of a change that was saying, actually, we're not seeing businesses doing this in the nice way. This might have to be done in the nasty way, which is actually, if you start using during these periods of times, the costs are going to look extraordinary. So you could see things like, I mean, we looked at the CM cost that Claire's just gone through, looking, you know, the increases in that is horrific. But imagine if that went up to the power of 10, or imagine if capacity, at the moment, if you breach your capacity, yeah, you get some kind of penal rate, but it's not that bad. Imagine if you lost capacity altogether, if you breached it, you know, and that's what we're starting to hear in European countries. The language is toughening because the incentive way didn't work. So either the things that future that I've just painted a picture of, those businesses that have understood their ability to be flexible, to be able to be agile, to know how they can continue their operation by shifting volume around, it means you're ready to take advantage when the nice stuff gets dangled, but it means you're also able to navigate and escape it if it does turn from carrot to stick.
Absolutely, and completely agree with everything you said there, and that echoes in conversations we've had with the likes of NISO, where they've clearly identified the opportunity from cold storage, and they're starting to, what they haven't quite understood is how their mechanisms can actually be viable for the way a cold store is operated, you know, the unique way fridges run and businesses have to operate. But they are starting potentially to understand that a bit more, and maybe those incentives are starting to increase. But I think they're very conscious that it's kind of maybe incremental. They keep slightly raising them until they find, as you mentioned, that bite point where suddenly they get sufficient kind of people taking part to meet their demands. But yeah, interesting you mentioned regulation in terms of actually forcing people to do this. Appreciate that's, I guess that's similar to the triads that we've had in the past, and that they didn't make any kind of, they didn't take account of the fact that there are critical businesses like cold stores that need energy, or a certain amount of energy certainty at certain times of the day. So that is a real risk, that if they can't find a way to make these mechanisms work, that potentially essential businesses and sites like cold stores will actually be forced to have to, maybe I think the triads from 4 to 7, that kind of time, be forced to switch off or pay exorbitant cost for energy at those times, and that's a real risk.
It is, Tom. And so I think there's a really important point you've just touched on here, and this is something I feel very strongly about, is amplifying the cold chain's voice to government. So this is something that, and it shouldn't be having to shout at government, because I don't think we have to. I think what we just need to do is to help them understand there's two things: how incredibly important and vital cold chain are for life, full stop, just amplifying that and reiterating that point over and over and over again. But the other thing is how useful the cold chain are. Like I said, there is multiple thermal batteries everywhere. These batteries are here and now. They could be used to a much greater effect. And hopefully, if we just keep amplifying that to government and getting them to think about that, how do we help them create, or maybe get them into a headspace where they're willing to think about the cold chain as something in its own right, rather than thinking generic across all business? Could we get them thinking just cold chain and the opportunity and the uniqueness that the cold chain brings? But we do need to have a consistent message back, because I do worry, like you do, Tom, that this broad strokes approach doesn't take into account energy intensive businesses at times.
Absolutely, and you're certainly talking our language there, and you know, we've been campaigning for a couple of years now about the critical nature of all of cold chain, but particularly cold stores as their role in energy and food supply, campaigning for cold stores to make critical infrastructure for exactly this reason. And we're currently finalising a white paper for a major launch at the beginning of June, bringing all of this together in terms of recommendations to government for the crucial role that cold chain plays in food and pharmaceutical security. So we'll be releasing that very soon. Conscious we're nearly out of time, Dan. Sort of want to finish on a positive. We've mentioned a few, I guess, challenges there around taking part in these mechanisms, but it's important to say that there are companies in the cold chain that are taking advantage of what's on offer at the moment, and it absolutely is a service or a set of services that businesses, if they follow your advice, can be taking advantage of at the moment, and you're working with businesses already around that. Yeah,
and ultimately, this is why our partnership is growing and getting stronger, because we do work with members within your chain already, and actually some who are actually advanced in that space. Where when we first had them in the conversations, they thought, well, actually, I think we've pretty much covered, turned every stone on this. I think we're pretty advanced, and yet we still, through a closer partnership, through that data science, through looking for those opportunities, found even more opportunities still. So we are, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about it from a supplier's point of view. I'm talking about it from a cold store's point of view. That's what we've been spending so much time learning over the last 18 months, to make sure it's your language we're talking, not supplier language. So we are learning through your members and those who we've actually got on supply as well, and we're bringing these services to. So it's very much real, and it's very much now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Claire, as well. And absolutely, this is a conversation, as you set out really well, we're going to be continuing for the foreseeable, and we're working with npower with these solutions to talk to the Department for Energy Security, Net Zero, to NISO, and really progress a lot of these points that Dan and Claire have made today. And I mentioned right at the beginning that this is part of 2 webinars, and actually we're back in a couple of weeks to almost listen to the other side on this directly from NESO, the National Energy System Operator, themselves, about some new mechanisms that they're making available this month, to really build on what Dan was talking about there in terms of starting to increase those incentives, starting to make those schemes more accessible. So I know Dan, you're going to be listening into that and helping me with some questions as well to NESO, but really recommend anybody listening to this webinar also sign up for that one in a couple of weeks' time. Details are on our website. But until then, Dan, Claire, thank you so much for that insight, and we really look forward to continuing our partnership and promoting and progressing the opportunities that you talked to today. So really recommend anybody listening in to get in contact with Dan and Claire, and there's some contact details on the screen there, or obviously you can find them on LinkedIn too. We've also been recording this session, so recording will be made available to everyone on our website, so please do listen back, because there's some really valuable insight there. And the slides actually from this are available in the materials tab of the webinar console as well. So I'll just leave the webinar open for a couple of seconds so you can download all that insight from the slides. But for now, thanks again, Dan. Thanks, Claire. We'll speak to you both very soon. Thanks for everybody for taking part, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks all. Have a great day.
Thank you.